Family has a way of revealing its true nature in the quietest moments when you least expect the ground to shift beneath your feet. I had built my life around being the steady presence others could count on, the one who handled details without complaint, but that ordinary afternoon in Chicago changed everything I thought I understood about loyalty and love. It started with a vibration that cut through the focused atmosphere of a client strategy session, pulling my attention away from spreadsheets and timelines toward a truth I had avoided for far too long. Hello, everyone. I am Luna Bennett, 33 years old. The quarterly review meeting at Evergreen Solutions had been underway for some time, with roughly 25 colleagues seated around the long table in the downtown conference room. We were discussing upcoming vendor agreements and budget projections for a major hospitality client when my phone buzzed face down on the polished surface. I recognized the pattern immediately from the family group chat, assuming it was another round of messages about seating charts or menu choices for my sister Vivian's wedding, which was now just 4 weeks away. Vivian is 3 years older than me. I glanced at the screen while still half listening to the presentation, and the preview text from my sister stopped me cold. "You are not invited to the wedding. Goodbye." I read the words twice, certain they would rearrange themselves into something less final, but they remained unchanged. A moment later, another notification appeared beneath it, showing that my mother had reacted with a thumbs up. The discussion in the room continued without pause. Someone chuckled at a comment I did not catch, and the projector hummed steadily. Yet something inside me locked into place with perfect clarity. It was not rage or heartbreak that filled the space, but a calm, deliberate calculation. Every single contract tied to that wedding carried my name and my financial responsibility. I had signed them all, funded every deposit from my own accounts, and now I was going to undo every one of them. I typed back a single word, "Fine," set the phone aside, and returned my attention to the meeting as if nothing had shifted. Behind my composed expression, however, a plan was already forming. My supervisor later stopped at my desk as people gathered their notes and discussed weekend plans, offering praise for my recent work on a complex client file. I thanked her with a steady voice and a professional smile, even though my chest felt strangely hollow. I had been with Evergreen Solutions for 7 years as a senior contract administrator, known for untangling difficult vendor agreements and keeping projects on track when others could not. Walking back to my office, another message arrived, this time directly from my mother. Vivian told me she handled it. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." The phrasing landed like a dismissal, as though I were an inconvenience rather than a daughter. There was no explanation, no apology, only the assumption that I would accept being cut out of my only sister's wedding through a casual group chat exchange. Vivian's wedding to Derek Langford was scheduled for 4 weeks from that Saturday at a lakeside venue outside the city. The venue itself had required a deposit of $58,000. Catering had come to $32,000. The florist, $13,500. The photographer, $9,200. And with the DJ rentals, cake, and all other expenses added in, the full commitment had exceeded $115,000. Every agreement listed my name at the bottom. Every initial payment had left my bank account. The pattern was familiar. Vivian had struggled with credit for years, and Derek's resources were supposedly locked in an investment. My parents had explained that their own finances were stretched thin at the moment, and that they would repay me once the wedding gifts arrived. It was the same assurance I had heard countless times before, whenever money was needed for one of Vivian's fresh starts or unexpected expenses. I sat at my desk with the door closed and opened the dedicated folder on my laptop containing every wedding document. Signed contracts and payment schedules filled the screen, each one bearing my signature. As I scrolled an email I did not recall seeing before caught my attention. It had been forwarded from Derek's account to Vivian 2 weeks earlier, and the visible preview contained language that did not belong in wedding planning, intimate phrases and references to someone identified only as Rachel. I made a mental note to examine it later and turned instead to the immediate task of protecting myself. This was not the first occasion on which I had been treated as the family's default solution rather than a person with her own boundaries. Brief memories surfaced of earlier moments when my own plans or resources had been redirected without discussion. When I was 8 years old, I had practiced for months for my first piano recital, every piece memorized and every pause intentional. My parents arrived late and left early because Vivian, who is 3 years older than me, had an important school event that evening that required their presence. I performed for a room that was only half full. My teacher later told me I showed real promise, yet at home, the accomplishment received only a brief acknowledgement before the conversation moved on. At 12, I won the county spelling competition the same week Vivian achieved something notable at her school. The photograph chosen for the family Christmas card that year featured her alone. By the time I turned 16, $28,000 that my grandparents had set aside for my future education had been quietly redirected to help cover Vivian's college expenses after she encountered difficulties adjusting to university life. My parents explained that I was capable and would secure scholarships while Vivian required additional support. Those patterns had continued into adulthood. At 24, I had saved carefully for my own apartment deposit, only to have the money borrowed for Vivian's move to a new city after a difficult period. I never saw repayment. At 29, I co-signed a car loan for her because her credit remained poor, and I eventually covered 8 months of missed payments when she forgot. More recently, there had been emergency transfers to help stabilize my mother's construction company during a tough quarter, along with covering medical costs and other shortfalls that always seemed to land on my shoulders. I maintained a private spreadsheet to track every instance, a way to confirm I was not imagining the steady drain. The running total of outstanding amounts had reached $135,000. I had tried raising the subject before, only to hear that keeping score was not what family did, or that I was fortunate to be the responsible one who could manage without help. The money itself had never been the core issue. Respect had been missing. 6 months earlier, Vivian had announced her engagement to Derek Langford. The planning moved quickly, and because Vivian's credit would not secure the larger deposits, and Derek's funds were described as unavailable until later, the contracts and payments fell to me. My parents assured me reimbursement would come from the wedding gifts and Derek's upcoming bonus. I signed the venue agreement, the catering contract, the florist arrangement, the photographer package, and all the smaller vendor agreements. Every document carried my name and my liability. Yet I noticed that Derek had paid for the honeymoon without hesitation, a 2-week trip that cost $15,000. Vivian's wedding dress had also been purchased directly from her own account. Resources existed for what mattered to them. The heavy infrastructure of deposits and legal responsibility had been placed on me because I was reliable and would not refuse. While reviewing the documents, I came across a prenuptial agreement draft saved in the wedding folder. The terms were heavily weighted to protect future inheritance as joint marital property. I did not open it fully at that moment, but the existence of the file raised questions I filed away for later. My phone rang with the first cancellation confirmation from the venue coordinator. She had been professional, but clearly surprised that a wedding 4 weeks out was being canceled by the person whose name was on every line. I confirmed I was the account holder and authorized the penalty, which I accepted as the cost of reclaiming control. I moved through the remaining vendors methodically. The catering company processed the cancellation with a 35% penalty on the $32,000 contract. The florist handled their portion with a 50% penalty on the $13,500 agreement. When I reached the photographer, she mentioned that Derek had called the previous week to upgrade the package and add a private room booking at the venue for the night before the wedding, which he had paid for in cash as a surprise. I knew immediately what that arrangement actually meant once I connected it to the emails I had seen. I canceled the entire photography contract on the spot. By early afternoon, I had dismantled the majority of the financial commitments. The total penalties I had accepted came to roughly $38,000, yet I had removed myself from more than $75,000 in remaining obligations. Each call had loosened something heavy that had pressed on me for years. My phone had continued to fill with messages from my mother, my father Benjamin, and Vivian herself. The tone ranged from confusion to anger to demands that I fix what I had broken. I read every one without replying. Threats and guilt no longer carried weight. An unknown number had also texted earlier that morning, asking to speak with me about Derek Langford and mentioning evidence that my sister should know. I arranged to meet the sender, a woman named Megan, who had worked with Derek for coffee the following day. Before I could leave the office, another message arrived from my Aunt Diane asking me to come by her house that afternoon because my mother had appeared at her door and was monitoring the situation. Something larger than a canceled wedding was being protected. I drove home through Chicago traffic on autopilot, the skyline familiar yet distant, as my mind turned over the day's revelations. My apartment in the West Loop felt quiet when I entered the space I had chosen and paid for myself, providing the only stability I could currently trust. I made tea and stood at the window watching the city lights begin to appear, then opened my laptop to organize the evidence I had gathered so far. Contract screenshots of the concerning emails and the prenup draft now sat in a new folder on my desktop. I added the messages from my family and the unknown number from Megan. The pattern was no longer just about money or exclusion. It was about control and hidden motives that stretched back further than I had allowed myself to examine. I turned my phone off for the night and prepared for what the next day would bring. The meeting with Megan might reveal more about Derek's intentions, and the conversation with my Aunt Diane could finally shed light on what had happened with my grandmother Clara's estate after her passing 3 years earlier. I had spent my life accepting that I was the one who could be overlooked, because I would endure it. That acceptance had ended the moment Vivian's message arrived. Now I was the one asking questions, and I intended to find every answer. The following morning arrived with a gray sky hanging low over the Chicago skyline, and I woke before my alarm with a clarity that felt both sharp and unfamiliar. I had not slept deeply yet. The restlessness carried a purpose rather than exhaustion. My mind moved steadily through the tasks ahead. Meet with Megan to hear what she knew about Derek Langford, then drive out to speak with my Aunt Diane and begin pulling at the threads connected to my grandmother Clara's estate. I dressed in simple professional clothes, made strong coffee, and stood at the window of my West Loop apartment watching the city stir below. The familiar grid of streets and the distant gleam of Lake Michigan offered no answers, but they grounded me in the present. I arrived at the coffee shop on Michigan Avenue 15 minutes early and chose a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and an easy path to the door. Old habits from years of managing complex contracts had taught me to stay aware of my surroundings. I ordered a black coffee I barely touched and waited, my phone face down on the table. At 9:15, the door opened and a woman in her late 20s entered, scanning the room with quick, nervous glances. She spotted me, hesitated for a moment, then walked over and slid into the seat across from me, clutching her own cup like a shield. Megan introduced herself in a low voice and explained that she had worked at the same investment firm as Derek until recently, when she had been encouraged to resign. She had known Rachel for years before the affair began, and Rachel had confided in her about the relationship. Megan had tried to warn my sister Vivian directly months earlier, but Vivian had blocked her on every platform and accused her of jealousy. The words came out in a rush once she started, as though she had been carrying the weight alone for too long. She confirmed the emails I had already seen were only part of the picture. Derek and Rachel had reconnected more than a year ago, and their plan had always included the wedding as a step toward access to family resources. The prenup draft I had found contained a specific clause that would turn any inheritance Vivian received during the marriage into joint property, automatically giving Derek half in the event of a divorce. Megan leaned closer and lowered her voice further. Rachel had once mentioned that the real payoff would come after the wedding when Derek would have legal ties to whatever money or property the family controlled. She did not know the exact details, but the implication was clear. Derek was not marrying for love or even for Vivian herself. He was marrying for a path into resources that did not truly belong to Vivian in the first place. I showed Megan the screenshots of the emails I had saved, and she nodded grimly, recognizing the pattern. Before we parted, she added one more detail that stayed with me. After she left the firm, Rachel had sent her a warning message implying that speaking further about the situation would bring consequences. The threat had been vague, but believable enough that Megan had hesitated before reaching out to me. I left the coffee shop with my thoughts racing and drove north toward the suburb where my Aunt Diane lived. The route took me through neighborhoods that grew quieter and greener as I moved away from the downtown core. My aunt's house sat on a tree-lined street with a small garden in front and wind chimes on the porch. She opened the door before I could knock, pulling me into a long hug that carried more warmth than I had felt from my immediate family in years. We sat in her living room with tea already prepared, and she wasted little time before telling me what she had been holding back since my grandmother Clara's passing 3 years earlier. My Aunt Diane had been present when my grandmother updated her will 8 months before her death. At that time, my grandmother was still sharp and deliberate, fully aware of what she wanted. She had specified that the lake house on the shores of Lake Michigan in Michigan, along with approximately $450,000 in savings, should go directly to me. She had named an attorney named Thomas Reed as executor, rather than anyone in the immediate family, because she wanted to ensure her wishes could not be altered. My aunt had received a copy of a letter my grandmother wrote at the same time, addressed to me in case anything went wrong after her death. She had kept the letter hidden because my mother had made it clear that interfering would bring serious problems. When I asked what had actually happened after the funeral, my aunt's expression tightened. My mother had taken control of all the paperwork and filed a different will with the probate court. That later document left everything to my mother herself and removed Thomas Reed as executor. My aunt had seen both versions and knew the signatures did not match. She had tried to speak with me at the funeral reception, but my mother had appeared and steered the conversation away. Later, when my aunt attempted to follow up, my mother had come to her house and warned her to stay out of family business. The message had been delivered with enough force that my aunt had backed away, though she had never stopped feeling uneasy about it. My aunt handed me the envelope containing my grandmother's letter. The paper was creased from being handled and stored carefully over the years. I read it slowly, the words settling into my chest with a mixture of grief and clarity I had not expected. My grandmother had written that she had watched the family for decades and understood how easily resources and attention flowed toward the loudest voices, while quieter ones were expected to manage alone. She wanted me to have a foundation that could not be taken away. She had seen the pattern of my mother leaning on me and had chosen to protect what she could. The letter ended with a direct instruction not to let anyone take what was meant for me. Tears came without warning as I finished reading. My aunt sat quietly beside me, giving me space to absorb what the letter confirmed. For 3 years, I had carried the quiet belief that my grandmother, like so many others, had not seen me as clearly as I had hoped. Now I held proof that she had seen everything and had tried to act on it. The anger that followed was cold and precise. My mother had not only altered the will, but had sold the lake house 9 months after the forged document went through probate. The property had brought $920,000 money that had apparently been used to keep my mother's construction company afloat during its ongoing difficulties. My aunt explained that she had overheard a conversation between my mother and my father Benjamin shortly after the funeral. My mother had said the matter was settled and that I would never know what had been changed. When my aunt had questioned her later, my mother had dismissed the concern and reminded her of the consequences of causing trouble. That same pattern of control had now extended to the wedding cancellations. My mother had shown up at my aunt's house the previous day with a warning that echoed the earlier threat. Someone was monitoring movements and conversations, and the family was circling to protect whatever remained of their secrets. I left my aunt's house in the late afternoon with copies of the letter and the notes she had kept. As I drove back toward the city, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and direct. "You were at your aunt's house today. Stop digging." The words confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The threats were not random. They were connected to the will, the sale of the lake house, and whatever financial pressures my mother's company was still facing. I replied with a single word, "No," and continued driving. Fear was present, but it no longer dictated my choices. By the time I reached my apartment, the light had begun to fade. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and began organizing them into clear categories. One folder held everything related to the wedding contracts and the evidence of Derek Langford's affair with Rachel. Another contained the prenup draft and Megan's statements. A third held the materials from my Aunt Diane, including my grandmother's letter, and the details about the two wills. I added the text threat I had just received. The picture was becoming complete, though several pieces still required confirmation from official records. I decided that first thing the next morning I would drive to Michigan to examine the probate files for my grandmother Clara's estate. The lake house had been located in a small community along the shoreline, and the county records office there would hold the original filings. I needed to see both versions of the will side by side and speak with anyone who might remember the attorney Thomas Reed. My mother had counted on silence and time to bury what she had done. 3 years had passed, but the evidence had not disappeared. I had spent my life being the person who absorbed every demand without protest. That version of me had ended 4 weeks before a wedding that would never take place. The next morning, I left my apartment in Chicago while the sky was still dark and the streets nearly empty. I had packed a small bag with copies of the documents from my Aunt Diane and the screenshots from the wedding folder, along with a thermos of coffee and a determination that felt steadier than anything I had experienced in years. The drive to Michigan would take roughly 3.5 hours, and I wanted to reach the county records office as soon as it opened. Highway lights blurred past as I crossed into Indiana and then continued north, the landscape gradually shifting from urban sprawl to open fields, and eventually the flatter terrain near the lake. My grandmother Clara's lake house had stood on the Michigan shoreline, and that was where the probate records for her estate had been filed. I kept the radio low, letting the quiet help me organize my thoughts before I faced whatever the files might reveal. I arrived in the small lakeside town a little before 9:30 and parked near the county courthouse, a solid brick building that looked as though it had witnessed generations of family disputes and quiet tragedies. The air carried the faint scent of the lake even from several blocks away. And for a brief moment I thought of the summers I had spent there as a child, walking along the shore with my grandmother, while she taught me how to read the fine print in any agreement. Those memories steadied me as I climbed the steps and entered the records office. The room smelled of old paper and floor cleaner, with tall filing cabinets lining the walls and a single clerk seated behind a high counter. She looked up from her computer as I approached and asked how she could help. I explained that I was looking for the probate file for Clara Bennett, who had passed away 3 years earlier. The clerk typed, slowly adjusted her glasses, and confirmed that the estate had been processed through their office. She asked for identification and then disappeared into the back room for several minutes. When she returned, she carried 2 folders, one thicker than the other, and placed them on the counter with a careful expression. She told me the first folder contained the will that had ultimately been accepted by the court, while the second held an earlier filing that had been marked as superseded. I opened the thicker folder first and found the document my mother had submitted. It left the entire estate, including the lake house and all financial accounts, to my mother alone, with herself named as executor. The date on the document was 8 months before my grandmother's death, yet the signature looked unsteady and lacked the confident flow I remembered from years of birthday cards and notes. I set that will aside and opened the thinner folder. This version was dated 2 months earlier than the one my mother had filed, and it had been witnessed by both my Aunt Diane and an attorney named Thomas Reed. The provisions were exactly what my aunt had described. The lake house and approximately $450,000 in savings were left directly to me, with smaller personal items going to my mother and my aunt. My grandmother had also specified that Thomas Reed should serve as executor to protect the terms. The signature on this earlier will match the handwriting I knew so well, strong and precise even in her later years. I looked from one document to the other and felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. The later will my mother had used carried a signature that appeared copied or traced rather than genuine, and the date placed it before the witnessed version, even though it had replaced it in the official record. The clerk watched me quietly for a moment and then offered to make copies of both files. She mentioned that she had seen similar situations before and understood how painful it could be when family members altered documents after someone passed. I thanked her and paid for the copies, then stepped outside into the morning light with the folders tucked under my arm. The evidence was now in my hands, physical proof that my mother had bypassed the proper legal process and installed herself as the sole beneficiary. The lake house itself had already been sold 9 months after the forged will went through, bringing $920,000 that had apparently been directed toward keeping my mother's construction company from collapsing under its mounting debts. I drove a short distance to a quiet overlook near the water and sat in the car for a while, spreading the copies across the passenger seat and studying the signatures side by side. The difference was unmistakable once I looked closely. The original will showed the same distinctive loop in the capital letters and the steady pressure that had characterized my grandmother's writing for decades. The version my mother had filed showed hesitation in several strokes and a slight slant that did not belong. I photographed both pages with my phone and sent the images to a secure folder before starting the engine again. My next stop was the retirement community where Thomas Reed now lived, a short drive along the lake shore in a peaceful setting of cottages and walking paths. The attorney met me in a small sitting room that overlooked a garden. He was in his early 80s but still sharp, and he recognized my grandmother's name immediately. He told me she had come to him 8 months before her death to update her will with very specific instructions. She had been worried that family members might try to redirect what she wanted to leave to me, and she had chosen him as executor because he had no personal stake in the outcome. He had prepared the document exactly as she requested and filed it properly. After her death, he had attempted to contact me directly with a letter explaining the provisions, but the letter had been returned marked as refused. He had then tried calling the family home only to be told by my mother that I was not interested in revisiting the matter. He had assumed at the time that the family had reached an understanding and had let the issue rest, though it had troubled him. I showed him the 2 wills I had obtained from the records office. He examined them carefully and confirmed without hesitation that the earlier document was the one he had prepared and witnessed. The later version was not in his handwriting or format, and the signature did not match my grandmother's. He offered to provide a formal statement and to testify if the matter went to court. He also gave me copies of his own notes from the meeting with my grandmother, which included her explicit direction that he serve as executor to prevent any interference. Before I left, he added one more detail that aligned with what my Aunt Diane had overheard. My grandmother had expressed concern that my mother might attempt to take control after her passing, and she had wanted safeguards in place precisely because she had seen how resources had been redirected away from me in the past. I drove back toward Chicago in the late afternoon with the new documents and the attorney's contact information. The pieces were fitting together with uncomfortable precision. My mother had altered the will to claim the lake house and the savings for herself, sold the property my grandmother had wanted me to have, and then used the wedding planning as another way to extract money and labor from me. The timing of the engagement 6 months earlier now made sense in light of the sale proceeds running low. Derek Langford's interest in the family had likely been encouraged once it became clear that my mother controlled assets that could be accessed through a marriage to my sister Vivian. The prenup clause, about future inheritance becoming joint property, was designed to capture whatever remained, or whatever might come to Vivian later. As I approached the city limits, my phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. This one was shorter than the last. "You are making a mistake that will cost more than you realize." I read it once, saved it with the others, and continued driving. The threats no longer surprised me. They confirmed that the people involved still had something to hide and were becoming nervous about how much I had already uncovered. I reached my apartment as the sun was setting behind the skyline and spread every piece of evidence across my kitchen table once more. The folder now contained the original and forged wills, the attorney's statement, and notes, the letter from my grandmother Clara, the company financial records, the prenup draft, the emails between Derek and Rachel, and the statements from Megan. I also included the text threats and the records of the penalties I had paid to cancel the contracts. I spent the evening cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a clear timeline of what my mother had done and how it connected to the pressure my sister and I had both felt. The construction company my mother owned had been facing lawsuits and tax liens for more than 2 years, with total exposure well over $600,000 before the lake house sale provided temporary relief. When those funds began to run out, the wedding had become the next source of cash and credit. I had been the reliable daughter who would sign whatever was placed in front of her and absorb the consequences without complaint. That reliability had been weaponized against me for decades, but it had also given me the skills and the records to dismantle the arrangement now. I turned off the lights in the apartment and sat in the dark for a while, watching the city glow through the windows. The drive to Michigan and the conversations with the clerk and the attorney had removed any remaining doubt. My mother had stolen what my grandmother had intended for me, and she had done it with calculation rather than impulse. My father, Benjamin, had either supported the decisions or chosen not to interfere, allowing the pattern to continue. My sister Vivian had been raised to expect that her needs would be met at the expense of others, including me. None of them had anticipated that I would stop absorbing the cost and begin asking for proof instead. The evidence I now held was enough to challenge the will in court and to expose the financial manipulations that had shaped our family for years. What I still needed to decide was how and when to use it. The next morning, I woke with the same focused energy that had carried me through the drive to Michigan and back. I had spent the night reviewing every document spread across my kitchen table, and the picture of what my mother had done was now sharp enough to act on. Before I could confront anyone directly, I needed to understand the full scope of the financial pressure that had driven the forgery and the sale of the lake house. My mother's construction company had been the reason she needed cash so desperately, and the public records would show exactly how deep the trouble ran. I arrived at the downtown Chicago office that handled business filings shortly after it opened. The clerk directed me to a bank of public computers where I could search for records on Bennett Construction without an appointment. I typed in the company name and watched as dozens of documents appeared on the screen. There were 3 active lawsuits from subcontractors and suppliers claiming unpaid invoices that together exceeded $700,000. One supplier had filed for nearly $240,000 in materials that had never been paid for, while another subcontractor was seeking $180,000 for work completed on a project that had been abandoned midway. A former employee had also brought a claim for wrongful termination and back wages that added another $90,000 to the total exposure. Beyond the lawsuits, 2 significant liens had been recorded against the company's assets. The Internal Revenue Service had placed a lien for $310,000 in unpaid payroll taxes, and the state had filed a separate lien for $115,000 in overdue workers' compensation premiums. The timeline was revealing. The first major lawsuit had appeared roughly 2 years earlier, not long after my grandmother Clara's death, and the liens had begun accumulating about 18 months ago. The sale of the lake house 9 months earlier had clearly been an attempt to inject cash and buy time, but the relief had been temporary. The company was still drowning, and the wedding contracts I had signed had become the next available source of credit and funds. I printed copies of the key filings and added them to the growing evidence folder on my laptop when I returned to my apartment. The pattern was now undeniable. My mother had stolen the inheritance to keep her business alive, sold the property my grandmother had wanted me to have, and then turned to the wedding as another way to extract value from me. Derek Langford's presence in the picture made sense once I connected the dates. His engagement to my sister Vivian had occurred around the same time the lake house proceeds were running low. Someone had introduced him to the family with knowledge of the remaining assets and the likelihood that more money could be accessed through marriage. That evening, a message arrived from my father, Benjamin. He asked me to come to the family home on Sunday for dinner so we could talk through what had happened with the wedding cancellations. The invitation felt like a trap rather than an olive branch, especially after the threats I had received and the way my mother had shown up at my Aunt Diane's house. I replied that I would be there, though I had no intention of walking into the conversation unprepared. I spent the next 2 days organizing the evidence into clear categories and practicing what I would say. The folder now held the original and forged wills, the attorney's statement, my grandmother's letter, the company financial records, the prenup draft, the emails between Derek and Rachel, and the statements from Megan. I also included the text threats and the records of the penalties I had paid to cancel the contracts. Sunday afternoon was warm for late spring, with sunlight filtering through the trees along the drive to the North Shore suburb where my parents lived. The house sat on a quiet street with a wide lawn and a 3-car garage, the kind of home that projected stability even when the foundation was cracking. I parked a short distance away, rather than pulling into the driveway, giving myself an easy exit if the conversation turned hostile. 2 extra cars were already there when I arrived. One I recognized as Derek Langford's polished sedan. The other belonged to a woman I did not know, but would soon learn, was Rachel. My father had not mentioned that anyone else would be present. The gathering was clearly meant to be an ambush rather than a family discussion. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell. Her smile was bright and practiced, but her eyes were watchful in a way that confirmed she was expecting resistance. She led me into the living room where my father Benjamin, my sister Vivian, Derek, and Rachel were already seated. The arrangement of the furniture felt deliberate, with the main chairs positioned to face the smaller seat they had left for me. I remained standing. My father began by saying they needed to discuss the damage I had caused to the wedding plans and how we could move forward as a family. I let him finish before I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it. I started with the wills. I laid the original document that my grandmother Clara had signed and witnessed next to the version my mother had filed with the court. I explained the date discrepancy and the clear difference in the signatures. My mother's face lost its color as she stared at the pages. My father shifted in his chair but said nothing. I then showed the statement from Thomas Reed, confirming that he had prepared the original will and that my mother had removed him as executor without legal authority. The room grew very quiet. My mother finally spoke, her voice tight, insisting that my grandmother had changed her mind at the end and that the later document reflected her true wishes. I pointed to the signature comparison and the fact that the original will had been filed first through proper channels. There was no credible explanation for why my mother had bypassed the attorney and submitted a document with a questionable signature. I moved next to the financial records of the construction company. I described the lawsuits and liens that had been mounting for years, and how the sale of the lake house for $920,000 had been used to cover immediate debts rather than to honor my grandmother's wishes. My mother had needed the money to keep the business from collapsing, and she had taken it from me without hesitation. My father finally found his voice and said that business pressures sometimes required difficult choices, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Vivian was staring at the documents with an expression I had never seen on her face before. A mixture of confusion and dawning realization that the family story she had always believed was not the full truth. I turned my attention to Derek Langford and the prenup draft I had found in the wedding folder. The clause that would make any inheritance my sister Vivian received during the marriage into joint property was designed to give him automatic access to family assets. I then showed the email thread between Derek and Rachel that had been accidentally saved in the shared folder. The messages revealed an ongoing affair that had begun before the engagement and continued throughout the planning period, including arrangements for a private room at this very venue on the night before the wedding. Rachel's face flushed, and she stood up abruptly, her voice sharp, as she demanded to know how I had obtained the emails. Derek tried to calm her, but she was already moving toward the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she left without another word. Vivian's voice broke the silence that followed. She asked Derek if any of it was true, if he had really planned to spend the night before their wedding with someone else, while claiming it was a surprise for her. Derek did not answer directly. He looked at my father instead, as though expecting support, but my father's expression had gone blank. I told Vivian that I had canceled the photography contract after the photographer mentioned the private room booking, and that the emails confirmed what the booking had really been for. My sister turned to our mother and asked why no one had told her any of this earlier. My mother's answer was that they had been trying to protect her from unnecessary stress during the planning. The explanation sounded as empty as every other reassurance I had heard over the years. I gathered the documents back into the folder and walked toward the door. My mother reached out as though to stop me, but I stepped past her without slowing. I told them that what I had shared was only the beginning, and that the rest of the evidence would come out when I decided the timing was right. My father called after me that we could still work through this as a family, but the words no longer carried any weight. I left the house and drove 2 blocks before pulling over to let the adrenaline settle. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my mind was already moving to what would happen next. Another text arrived from an unknown number as I sat there. It read simply that I had made a serious mistake and that the family would not forget what I had done. I saved it with the others and started the car again. The Sunday dinner had confirmed everything I suspected. My mother had forged the will and sold the lake house to save her company. My father had supported the decisions, or at least looked the other way. Derek had targeted the family for access to money that was never truly theirs to give. Vivian had been kept in the dark about the same way I had been for most of my life. The only difference was that I had finally stopped waiting for permission to see the truth. I drove back toward the city with the folder on the seat beside me. The wedding was now only a few days away, though the original plans had already collapsed. My father had apparently managed to keep some version of the event on the calendar by rebooking the venue under a different description, but the guest list and the purpose had changed. I had no intention of letting the performance continue without the full story being told. The evidence I held was strong enough to challenge the will in court and to expose the financial manipulations that had shaped every interaction I had ever had with my family. What remained was to decide whether to reveal everything at the wedding itself or to let the legal process begin first. Either way, the silence that had protected them for years was over. 2 days after the tense dinner at my parents' house, the day that had originally been planned as my sister Vivian's wedding arrived with clear skies over the Chicago area. My father Benjamin had managed to keep the lakeside venue booked by rebranding the gathering as a family celebration meant to show resilience during difficult times. The guest list had been trimmed, but roughly 120 people still arrived in formal attire, many of them business associates and investors connected to my mother's construction company. I had decided to attend, not because I wanted to celebrate anything, but because I needed to deliver the remaining pieces of the truth in a setting where silence would no longer protect anyone. I arrived at the venue early in the evening and parked away from the main entrance. The building glowed with string lights and elegant floral arrangements that had clearly been rushed into place at the last minute. Two security guards stood at the doors checking names against a list. When I gave my name, one of them spoke quietly into a radio before allowing me inside. My father was waiting in the foyer, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. He said he was surprised I had come, and I replied that I had unfinished business with the family. He did not try to stop me as I walked past him into the main ballroom. The space had been arranged with round tables covered in white linens and a small stage at one end, with a microphone already set up. Chamber music played softly from hidden speakers, while guests mingled with champagne glasses in hand. I spotted my mother Brooklyn near the kitchen entrance speaking with a server in a low voice. My sister Vivian stood by the windows, pale and watchful, her eyes scanning the room as though expecting something to go wrong. Derek Langford had not yet arrived. I took a position near the back wall where I could observe without drawing immediate attention and waited. At 7:30, the main doors opened and Derek walked in with Rachel at his side. She wore a formal dress and held his arm with a possessive grip that made several heads turn. Derek's smile was sharp and confident as he surveyed the room, but it faltered slightly when he noticed me. He guided Rachel toward a table near the front and then made his way in my direction. He leaned close and said that he hoped I understood this was not the time or place for more disruption. I told him the time for discretion had ended the moment he and my mother had decided to build their plans on stolen property and hidden affairs. Derek's expression hardened, but before he could respond, the chamber music stopped. I had already moved to the stage and picked up the microphone. The room fell quiet as conversations paused and faces turned toward me. I introduced myself clearly as Luna Bennett, the daughter whose name had appeared on every contract for an event that was never going to happen as planned. I explained that I had come to share the truth about why the original wedding had collapsed and why the family celebration taking place tonight was built on the same foundation of deception that had shaped our lives for years. I began with my grandmother Clara's will. I held up copies of both documents and described how the original version signed and witnessed 8 months before her death had left the lake house in Michigan and approximately $450,000 in savings directly to me. I then showed the later version my mother Brooklyn had filed with the probate court, a document dated earlier, but bearing a signature that did not match my grandmother's handwriting. I explained that my mother had removed the appointed attorney Thomas Reed as executor and installed herself in his place without legal authority. The lake house had been sold 9 months later for $920,000, with the proceeds used to prop up my mother's failing construction company rather than to honor my grandmother's wishes. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Several of my mother's business partners exchanged glances and began speaking quietly among themselves. I moved next to the financial records I had obtained from the public filings. I described the 3 active lawsuits totaling more than $700,000 and the liens from the Internal Revenue Service and the state that together exceeded $425,000. The company had been in serious trouble for more than 2 years, and the theft of the inheritance had been an attempt to buy time when other options ran out. I then turned to Derek Langford and the prenuptial agreement draft that had been saved in the wedding documents. The clause that would treat any inheritance my sister Vivian received during the marriage as joint marital property had been written to give Derek automatic access to family assets. I showed printed copies of the email thread between Derek and Rachel that had been accidentally preserved in the shared folder. The messages revealed an ongoing affair that had begun before the engagement and continued throughout the planning period, including arrangements for a private room at this very venue on the night before the wedding. Rachel's face went white, and she stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving Derek standing alone in front of the stage. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Business partners clustered together, some already pulling out their phones. My mother had disappeared through a side door. My father remained seated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Vivian stood near the windows with tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of betrayal and confusion. I set the microphone down and walked off the stage as the chaos continued around me. Several guests approached me with questions, but I told them the documents spoke for themselves and that legal proceedings would follow. I left the venue and drove back toward the city as the evening light faded. My phone began buzzing with notifications before I had even reached the highway. Someone had already posted video of my statement on social media, and the clip was spreading quickly. By the time I reached my apartment, the video had been viewed thousands of times, with comments pouring in from people who recognized the pattern of being overlooked and financially drained by their own families. I saved the link and turned off the notifications, then sat at my kitchen table with the evidence folder in front of me. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded faster than I had expected. My mother's construction company filed for bankruptcy protection less than 10 days after the event at the venue. The lawsuits accelerated, and several major investors withdrew their support once the public records and my statement made the extent of the financial trouble impossible to ignore. My father, Benjamin, distanced himself from the business and from my mother, though he never offered a direct apology for the role he had played in allowing the forgery and the manipulation to continue. Vivian reached out through text messages that were careful and uncertain at first. She had begun therapy and was trying to understand